Uh, so our next focus is on Foucault and how Foucault saw discourse, right? So among critical discourse theories such as Foucault, the term discourse refers not only to language or social interaction, but also relatively bounds of social knowledge. Now this is important because Foucault, as we saw earlier, he was looking at knowledge through a different lens, right? So it's more a matter of political, sociological, historical, and so on. So that is what he means here by social knowledge, right? Now it's also interesting here because this is the new approach, right? And it's far more inclusive of the social power. And with exceptions, it is almost impossible to find this use of language of the term in other largely Anglo-American approaches. If our prior conceptions of discourse have mainly been linguistics or sociological one, we now have to completely rethink that idea. We may need to be prepared to think of it as a totally different concept in totally different fields, which just happens to have the same name as we already know. So according to this new position, in any given historical period, we can write, speak, or think about given social practice, madness, for example, only in certain specific ways and not others. A discourse would then be whatever constraints, but also enables writing, speaking, thinking within such historical limits. And we deliberately speak of a discourse in the singular, for even though Foucault very frequently uses the mass noun discourse. Yeah, he is typically keen to point out that this is something of a theoretician's shorthand, a way of signaling some common and general properties of discourse. Historically, specific discourses, for example, medicine in the 19th century, are quite distinct from one another, as well as from earlier and later forms of themselves, which may or may not have the same names. As we have seen, they are discontinuous. I want to pay attention to the examples given as well. Madness and then medicine in the 19th century. These were explicitly areas that Foucault researched on. These were Foucault's areas on madness and medicine. So Foucault tried to trace this complex coming together and departures in the order of things. Sometimes he treats the discourses separately. At other times, he looks at their contribution to the possibility of each period having an overall view of the world, which he calls the Western episteme. Right? So Western episteme is knowledge. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. So Western episteme means Western knowledge. For example, he finds that in the 16th century, the table of human sciences had no concepts of life and labor at all. Nor was language thought of as a signifying system or medium. It was simply there as one of the figurations of the word, a natural device like air and water. Moreover, this may be difficult for contemporary readers to appreciate. There was no concept of man or humanity. In fact, Foucault argues that what we now call humanity had no way of conceptualizing its separateness until the 19th century. Right? So humanity is barely a century old. A little focus, or rather a little background info into this. Humanity came with, I think, rather than saying it's 19th century, but it's also 19th century. 19th century was where classicism in the sense the classics were coming to life again. And those were so 16th century is more to do with the post-medieval understanding of things. And then in the 17th century, you had the emergence of the novel. People were looking at how the society was coming to be. And there was some sort of human in this area. Uh, Sorry, 18th century was the novel. 17th century was far to do with the modernist, rather uh, post-medieval and enlightenment, age of enlightenment era. And then 18th century came the novel, and then 19th century, so late 18th centuries and 19th century saw the romantic era where emotion was coming into being, when nature was being grappled at again, where the man's emotions became prominent. So until it says the separateness of until the 19th century possibly means that this was in the social arena, but properly documentation, properly conceptualizing it perhaps came in the 19th century. So the discipline called natural history in the 17th and the 18th century was purely descriptive and taxonomic. So there you go. Taxonomy being a table of types, in this case, of life forms. These scientists merely collected describes in tabulated species and types. They never tried to form overall theories, as did Darwin in the 19th century. Such forms of thoughts simply weren't available, right? So discipline known as the analysis of wealth merely try to examine forms of exchange and trade, and as though what we would now think as humanly produced commodities were natural things to be brought and sold. There was also at this time a discourse which dealt with language called general grammar, but just as natural history collected tabulate species and the analysis of wealth inspected forms of exchange. So general grammar seemed happy to separate language into nouns, verbs, and examine their types. By the early 19th century, these three discourses have become much more distinct. They had become separate sciences: early biology, early economics, and philological linguistics. As the period known as Enlightenment, right? And particularly Kant's analysis of the limits and the finites of what is what language could achieve began to have its effects on these separate discourses, appear to have a previously unforeseen object in common, man, right? So this was during Enlightenment. So Enlightenment in the 19th century is what we're saying. Right, so it became possible to say that man lives, man labors, man speaks. This this makes possible the field of human sciences. There are now new objects which require new analysis with distinct discourses covering each of three areas: psychology, sociology, and the studies of literature and myth. Yeah, so then in the 20th century, structuralism announces the death of man. The idea that man is a fiction and has always been really absent, and what we call humanity is a false construct. With respect to life, psychology is replaced by psychoanalysis, right? So, which assumes that a uniform structure known as the unconscious inhibits each of us, and in less identical ways. As for labor, ethnology now replaces sociology, and structural conditions situate human societies as mere responses, albeit differentiated, instead of calling it differentiated, to universal conditions and needs. And in the case of language, structural linguistics looks for linguistic universals beneath the specific and unique bits of language which are written and spoken. Now, contemporary discourses, including what we might add the discourses on discourse, are put in their historical position. They're relativized, they're pluralized, so they can no longer have unique access to truth. And truth becomes a function of what can be said, written or thought. And Foucault's project becomes one of exposing the historical specificity and the sheer fact that things could have been otherwise of what we seem to know today as such certainty. So, okay, our immediate question. So we were reading all this time to come to this part, right? So what does Foucault mean by discourse? So after working on what he called the discourses of life, labor, and language in the order of things, he immediately begins to try to theorize this concept of discourse in his next book, so The Archaeology of Knowledge. This is perhaps Foucault's most difficult work. Yeah, so we'll move on. So here Foucault tries to spell out what he means by discourse, and the best way to deal with Foucault's approach to discourse is to work carefully through the order of things, right? And then to read Archaeology of Knowledge. Because the type of discourse theory to which Foucault contributed is less well known in the English-speaking circles than formal and empirical approaches, right? So a brief historical preamble is in order. So, for example, we are again looking at the pre-Foucauldian critical discourse originated from the continental, largely French philosophical traditions. It has cogent application in relation to history of ideas rather than to formal language systems or social structures. So Sullivan et al. Argue that it began with structuralism and its opposition to those inherited habits of thought and analysis, which assumed that social and cultural objects existed in the real world, ready to be seized and adequate. The structuralists tried to show that, on the contrary, these objects exist only as products, not sources of signification. But this position on discourse, which still differ from Foucault's in its attaches discourse primal to signification, does not mean that anything goes, right? Anything goes. Something always said by Feyerabend. Because objects are said to be discursively produced, this does not imply that we can make the world into anything that we simply want by speaking. Instead, structuralist and semiotic approaches to discourse were intended as critiques of individualism and idealism. According to this position, what we can imagine, let alone put into practice, is both permitted and constrained by the discursive, that is, representational possibilities at our disposal. Thus, both the world and the consciousness of it are effects of kinds of representations we can make of it. But at the same time, discourse is not just a form of representation. It is a material condition or set of conditions which enables and constrains the socially productive imagination. These conditions can therefore be referred to as discourses or discursive conditions of possibility, and the Russian analysis, Voloshno, showed that these discourses, forms of representation, can come into contention and struggle. The struggle is no more clearly seen than in human sciences themselves, right? Where, Kuhn calls paradigms may compete for dominance in a particular field, right? If no case springs to mind immediately, then remember that one may before us, here and now. And the case of discourse analysis itself, where what discourse is and how is it analyzed, is already contended by different approaches. Yeah. So moving on. So this is, so what is Foucault saying really? Like, it makes, there's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of stuff going on, but what is Foucault trying to say? what basically what I understand is he says discourse is almost like a well-rounded area of social knowledge rather than language or just social interaction. And it's also a very guiding body of knowledge. It's almost like the paradigm that Kuhn is talking about, right? And he says there is always that man is the measure of everything coming into being um, with the 19th century ideas. And so what he says is um, it's almost so like when we look at it, um, what I understand is that the discursive conditions of such a possibility, right? Um, it's that discursive construct which makes us talk about things and not talk about things. For example, when I talk about a flower, I may talk about it in my understanding, and I may have not at all thought about something, a new perspective of a flower, right? One thing I actually wanted to point out here is that when it comes to like organizational structures and you have different boards coming in to govern the organization every now and then sometimes I think, you know what, we did everything this time. What are the next people are going to going to be doing, right? And at these moments, it's when a discourse comes up because there is no end. You have limitless possibilities that you may not have thought of even, right? And so Voloshinov, the Russian linguist, looks at uh, realities, side by side, the natural world and science and all of that, right? Um, so in Foucault's discursive regime, this is um, it's a quite different approach. So, for example, now Foucault here argues that the formal and the empirical approaches, so the non-Foucauldian ones, have tended to work on the side of enunciation, right, of discourse. Enunciation, he means the technique, structure, forms of know-how by people, and recognize utterances, right? So he says this is a very narrow focus, right? So it's a surface of language where there is no sociology involved, where there is no society involved, which he thinks is rather narrow, right? Um, and later he looks at um, the failure, there is to specify these terms, discourse and statement. He says, instead of gradually reducing the rather fluctuating meaning of the word discourse, I believe that I have in fact added to its meanings, treating it sometimes as a general domain of all statements, sometimes as an individualizable group of statements, and sometimes as a regulated practice that accounts for certain number of statements that I have not allowed in the same word discourse, which have served about to vary. I shift my analysis. Da, 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 da. Yeah. Um, yeah. So his understanding conflicts with one another, right? And later he goes from like thought to thought. I want to read this little part of whether statements can be units of discourse. Um, But he's talking about statement and the rules which govern them are not purely linguistics. And I think we've established this, like we looked at how sociology comes into play, how society comes into play, right? We must always turn to the specific historical conditions, to the piecemeal, the local and the contingent, even no matter how specific can happen just as anyhow. Um, yeah, and these mean that discourse always function in relation to power relations. Um, Now, this is like the central topic of Foucault. Foucault always talks about power. He says knowledge is power. And when he says knowledge is power, he does not mean that acquiring knowledge is is an effect of power, is through influence of power, but also the fact that knowledge is defined by power. It is power that brings knowledge into existence, and that is quite interesting, because power is crucial to any understanding of Foucault's theory of discourse. We must consider it here briefly. For Foucault, power is very different from traditional sociopolitical conceptions of it. Discourse is not a mere effect or end product of pre-existing power. No power is owned by some privileged persons or exercised simply as an obligation or prohibition of those who do not have it. Power for Foucault is just not a ruthless domination, right? In fact, it is not to be had at all, right? Power is everywhere. That's what he says. Not because it embraces everything, but because it comes from everywhere. Power comes from below. There is no binary, all-encompassing opposition between ruler and ruled. Um, and no such duality extending from top down to reacting on more limited groups to the depths of social body. One must suppose rather that the manifold relations of force that take shape and come into play into machinery of production in families, limited groups, and institutions are the basis of wide-ranging effects of cleavage that run through the social body as a whole. So yeah. So in there are criticisms, Eco says, this radical thinking is not, connected to language. So instead, Foucault's image of power closely recalls the idea of systems that linguists call the given knowledge. The given knowledge is true coercive. Um, right. So it's almost like the structure, the standardization of knowledge, of language. It's a social product. It originates as a constructive apparatus, precisely through general assent. I'm not sure we can say that given language is a device of power, but surely is a model of power. Um, yeah, so looking at all these effects, we understand that there is some sort of power play in it, right? Um, and at the same time, I want to also look at the limits of language, limits of analysis. I don't see here, but Foucault gives three limits of analysis, right? He says the sentence level, proposition level, and statement level. I think we also may have passed it. So for example, sentence level, right? So it's very structural, whereas proposition level, it's quite declarative, truth or falsities are looked at. It's also rather empirical. Whereas statement, this doesn't always um, follow grammar. It also plays with power, right? Um, Basically, it's rather mocking power or establishing power, maybe creating trouble, right? So, for example, like if you say sentence wise, right? If you say something like Judaism is the main religion of Sri Lanka, main religion of Sri Lanka, it's correct, right? In the sentence level, it is, it has subject, verb, object, all of that. Propositional level, if you say all flowers are red, It's very declarative. It's also very empirical because you're looking at an observation. Then you also have statement level. An example here is perhaps Judaism is the main religion of Sri Lanka, which is not true, but the statement is it doesn't make sense, and that's okay. And it's rather playing with power, it perhaps is mocking or rather establishing a power. It's either creating trouble, it's being dismissive, um, and so on. It's almost like an own version of truth, right? Um, so this is what Foucault is looking at. Yeah. Um, and we understand this by understanding, okay, what I'm looking at, what is this that we're looking at sort of thing, right? So that's basically it for all of this. So let's go to page um, 90. We will look at power as well. And just go to around 90. I think discourse is still there until about 90, page 90. So we're looking at power, we're looking at discourse. Yeah. This is basically what we were talking about, a Foucault primer, discourse, power, and the subject. Yeah.